guys, in this video I'd like to offer you a few strategies for increasing the effectiveness of your practice from the moment that you first set your eyes on a new piece of music. So this is the part in the learning process where you are the most likely to make mistakes, and while you might think that you can just fix them later, it's best to avoid them in the first place because your brain's always on record and you are a product of your habits. And this includes things like wrong notes or right ones. So you want to try to get the correct, reliable information in your brain as early as possible. Ideally, I would think that you would want that, with as little struggle as possible, right? You want it to be as effortless as possible because you want to rise above the level of the notes and rhythms and think about the music, as early as possible. You want this efficiency, okay? So how to do this in your practice comes down to how well you manage difficulty, okay? And now, first of all, this assumes that you're not working on a piece that's too difficult for you, but assuming that you're working on a piece that's an appropriate challenge and you just looked at it and you're, in that sight reading phase, especially if you don't feel confident or if you're like most people where your sight reading ability sort of lags behind your playing ability a little bit, that's totally normal. You want to reduce the difficulty of what you're working on. And this means that you need to find a way to focus. And there are 3 ways to do this. These are obvious things that you've heard before, but I want you to think about how they are related. So the 3 things are slowing down, splitting the hands apart, and narrowing the scope of what you're actually working on. That means working in smaller sections, okay? Now, of course, you've heard all of these things before a million times, I'm sure. But I'd like you to think about how they are related to one another. And also, I'd like you to think about how hand-separate practice fits in, because there is an important component here. Are you going to remain super dependent on the music, or are you trying to really learn it and become autonomous and detach yourself from the music where you don't have to think about it, okay? And if you are going for that autonomy that I'm referring to, then hand-separate practice is going to be really valuable, because when you are focusing on one hand at a time, you're not having to worry about all of the complicated relationships between the hands. Now you might say, well, but that's ultimately going to be needed, so why not get started on that as soon as possible? Well, the reason why you don't want to get started on that as soon as possible, in some cases, not all cases, but some, is that by committing to hands together practice before you're ready, it means that you're going to have to narrow the scope or slow down dramatically. And it's possible to go so slow that your brain can't hear the music and you can't really internalize anything and you have virtually no chance at autonomy, okay? So, all of these things come in moderation and reason, but realize that if you narrow the scope of what you're practicing, you'll be able to play it faster. Also, if you split your hands apart, you'll be able to play it faster. If you decide that you need to be able to do a lot of material at once, you don't know it very well, and you want your hands together, you're going to have to play it really, really slowly. So these things are all related to one another. So I like to think of them as tools. Which tool is right for the job? Is it hand-separate practice? Is it slow practice? Is it practice in very short little bits here, okay? So I'd like to give you an example. This is a piece that I played back in college, and I've been trying to resurrect it recently. And when you first set your eyes on something like this is the Fauré Nocturne number 4 in E-flat major, which starts something like this. Okay. So this part that we're looking at right here is sort of the climactic part of this piece, and it's filled with accidentals. It's in a difficult key. It's not something that you would want to look at and say, oh, I'm just going to read this whole page and practice it a bunch of times. Well, you're probably not going to get very far unless you're an amazing sight reader, okay? So, in fact, there's enough going on here. You can immediately see that you're going to have to employ the use of all 3 tools. You're going to have to spend some time hand separate because otherwise it will take forever to learn each little thing. You're definitely going to have to narrow the scope, and you are going to have to go really slow. Now, if you decide that you want to practice only hands together from the outset, then you might start with the first note on the right hand, start with the first chord on your left hand or whatever, and you play it, and then you figure out what the next thing is, and then you play that, you figure out what the next thing is, right? Assuming that you can't literally sight read this, which I don't know many people that could, okay? That's gonna take forever. Also considering that your working memory is like 10 to 15 seconds or whatever, I mean, you're gonna forget the beginning of what you just did really, really fast in this situation. So you're gonna be forced to use your three tools on something like this, okay? So I wouldn't have to do that. Like if I played hands separate and I narrowed the scope, I wouldn't have to go so slow. So for example, let's say I just looked at the left hand of this first measure on the page here, okay? And I decide, all right, I'll go a beat at a time and I'll try to get that in my hand. So instead of doing this, assuming you wouldn't make mistakes anyway, right? This assumes that you can read all of this and make no mistakes, which is, you're probably going to make mistakes if you're doing this. Instead, you can split your hands up and also narrow the scope, and you won't have to go so agonizingly slow. And so on. And you can even count. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and right? You can start to see how these notes are related to one another, and you can build this sense of what the gestures are in the music, like groups of information, chunks of information, as opposed to this. Because now you have to worry about the interaction between the hands, That's a lot harder, okay? And so the reason I mention this is because ultimately you're not going to be reading something like this. You're going to get it in your memory and you're going to play it from memory. You're not going to be thinking about this. It'll be a total bottleneck if you try to read this, okay? So I'll play a little bit of this as it's supposed to be played from what I can remember. Not perfect, but it's fine. So note that I'm not really a memorizer these days. I do a lot more reading than memorizing just because of the nature of my work. But I definitely memorized this, okay? And because I knew that I needed to memorize this, hand separate practice immediately had value to me because I could train this part. Sorry, let me do that again. I could feel how all of those things are related and just get them into my memory and autonomize them so much easier than if I tried to do it with both hands at once. That would have necessitated the tempo to be much slower, and I would not have been able to see the groups of notes. And you want to think in groups when you are memorizing information. You want to get it in your memory and detach yourself from the music. And so, that's where these three tools actually come into play. This piece is just one example. It's not super complicated in terms of the rhythm, but the notes are pretty challenging. So when you have rhythmic difficulties too, that also makes it to where hand separate practice becomes a really necessary or really slow practice, or whatever. But the bottom line is, it's important to not have to play so insanely slow that you can't even get it into your head, that you can't even autonomize it. Because basically what you're doing in that situation is you're committing to relying on the music perpetually, which will ultimately slow you down. And if the piece is ultimately supposed to go fast, you need to actually learn it. You can't just read it. You need to actually learn it and autonomize it. Okay, so some memory is involved. That's why hand separate practice is helpful, because you can build autonomy faster in each hand, especially over multiple days. And also narrowing the scope. If you decide that you are going to commit to playing large amounts of material at once and you're new at a piece, well, you're going to go really slow. And that's probably not the best way to learn. As you get faster at it and you are relying on the tool of lowering the tempo less and less, then you can increase the scope. And then you can start to put the hands together. And so I just wanted you to see and think about how these three things are related. There is always precedent for hand separate practice. There's always precedent for really, really slow practice, but not too slow, where you can't make sense out of everything. And of course, there's precedent for chopping up things in beats, And then I could wait and do the next one. And then I could wait and do the next one. And so on, okay? So in this situation, I am narrowing the scope, which means I don't have to go quite as slow, and I can put my hands together a little earlier on in the process as possible. So be thinking about how these things are related and hopefully you found this helpful. I also did want to mention that I know I haven't posted in a while, and that's because things have been really crazy around here. My wife and I just had our third child, and so the house has definitely not been quiet, and it's been pretty crazy. But also, I've been between audio interfaces, and I've been dealing with some issues with my audio interface that I was using to power this setup, and I had to exchange it a couple of times and switch to different things. I went through like 4 different things to finally settle on what I'm using now for this video. So of course, I haven't been able to post, so hopefully that's not that big of a deal. But anyway, I will go back to regular posting, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and also my future postings. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.